Hi. In the last video, we talked about the rise of social media and why it replaced newspapers. And the short answer is that advertisers and advertising dollars were looking for a better return on investment. The even shorter answer is it's about the money, and it always has been. But it's a fair premise. If you're an advertiser, you're worried about self-dealing among newspaper companies and their allies. A San Jose Mercury News could buy shares, or whoever owns the San Jose Mercury News could buy shares in a hotel company, and then afterwards the hotel company would start purchasing newspapers and then creating essentially false demand or falsified demand. And of course the hotel industry would have to deal eventually with increased labor costs, and the whole thing seemed unsustainable. And when technology companies came in, they promised a definitive return on investment. You could see exactly how many people would interact with your ad, and not only that, but exactly how many people would see it. Those are called impressions, by the way. It turns out that everyone was naive about the efficacy and authenticity of digital media and digital tracking systems. Not only because of spoofing, but because technology is global, and because it is global, it is capable of being manipulated worldwide. Whereas if you are a newspaper company, and you do in fact engage in self-dealing, there's a limited number of hotels that you can, convince to get to buy your newspaper if it's not a good product. Whereas, once again, once you go digital, the idea behind digital media is that it is something that is infinite, though of course storage capacity applies. But that's increasingly becoming, less of a problem. Now, let's move on to another topic. It's kind of related. So, I'm playing this game called SimCity, which is short for Simulation City. And it's a game that teaches you how to build a city from scratch. It's a brilliant game. I'm playing it on my mobile phone. I used to play it on, I think it was a floppy disk. That's quite some time ago, when it first came out. And I was stunned by the program then, and I'm still happy with the program today. A little bit heavy on the pro-police and pro-fire station propaganda, but beyond that, it is a brilliant exercise in city planning. And even the pro-police and pro-firefighter bubbles that pop up, reminding you how much the residents love the police station and police uniforms and attractive firefighters, they serve a purpose because it's expensive to have a fire station, especially a bigger one. You can choose different sizes, and all of them, of course, vary in price. But you understand how a city like New York City was made back in the day when there was no debt. There was no cheap debt. And you had to build only if you had the tax revenue or fees, fines, and so on and so forth. And so you can see why, if you don't have debt, you immediately see when you're building the city, which does not have a banking system, you can't borrow money. So you just have to wait until you trade enough items, which means you have to manufacture enough items, and then only then are you able to build fire stations and so on and so forth. And the first thing that pops up is, you really want to buy after you build, a power plant, and you build, after that, you've got to build a fire station to protect the buildings. After that, it's the police, and then it's the sewage. And the game is also brilliant in that it teaches you that you can have wind power and renewable energy, but it's expensive. And if you don't have unlimited funding, you are going to have to buy a coal plant and stick it far, far away from the center of town because it pollutes. That doesn't mean, obviously, pollution goes away. It just means it disappears from sight. Another good metaphor for why we have a lot of political problems, because a lot of our problems are literally out of sight, even though the effects are still global. when Indonesia blows a volcano, Singapore feels it. So if you have enough experience, you can look at this game and figure out sort of reverse engineering that are happening now. You can imagine a different scenario where, you build the building and then you have to upgrade the roads, and then people want education. So you're building close by to each other because the capacity of a fire station is limited. It can only cover so much ground in a specific time period. Same thing with police. That's why they're so expensive. Even aside from including things like pension obligations, long-term obligations that are increasing, in some cases exponentially, depending on where you are and depending on what your tax base looks like. And so you look at this and you realize that we are now in a position today where we really can build a house that is, quote unquote, a smart house that doesn't need the local fire department to be there. It can have sprinklers everywhere. And so you're in a position where suddenly all those obligations, as well as upfront costs, can go away if the upfront cost of building in those fire detection and extinguisher systems go into the cost of building a house. The same thing with solar power. People in Germany figured out that if you want to build, it's a lot easier if you want to make solar power something more mainstream. Any new development has to have it. And that way the costs are spread out. And as we know, economics 101, the more people buy your product, the easier it is to take out debt because you've got cash flow coming in that pays off that debt, that then allows you to roll over that debt in conjunction with the bank. So if only one house on this block gets solar panels, the company that provides those solar panels will probably go out of business at some point simply because it's taken out debt to buy. It can't tax anybody. So it's taken out debt to buy those, solar panels, to hire the employees, and so on and so forth. So there has to be some sort of critical mass at some point. The idea behind debt is to get that critical mass if your product is useful. And Germany realized, well, now these people are competing with entrenched interests, both public and private. The local governments, of course, get money from the existing private companies through taxes. They're concerned that a new player, if it disrupts that business, may lower tax revenue, and so on and so forth. So Germany decided to go that path. That seems to be working out as well as can be expected. So you can imagine a scenario where suddenly the SimCity of the future has houses that are self-cleaning, that don't actually need fire departments, which are, again, extremely expensive. You can invest that in education, social welfare, trade, etc. Same thing, by the way, with police. You can have robots that monitor premises. All this can be done, effectively now because you have not only satellite communication, but also we had facial recognition software, but now we have object recognition software. So you don't want to build an office building with sprinklers, put a video camera there, and then, have a scenario where somebody's large mug of coffee gives off steam that activates the sprinklers. So the idea in the past has been that technology has almost always made jobs because you still had to have a decently intelligent human being behind the scenes making sure that things don't go haywire. And that's been true up to now. It still will be true, but not as much, because now you've got surveillance technology that can differentiate between steam coming from a cup of coffee and an actual fire. 3D, recognition, so on and so forth. So that way, if somebody takes a paper cutout of from fifth grade classroom of a fire, because they're trying to learn the word for fire, it's not going to activate the sprinklers, and so on and so forth. So you can see that all this is tied into the surveillance state, but in a way that threatens the existing interests within the surveillance state itself. Because if you could somehow wave a wand and make all these houses over here self-sustaining, you suddenly wouldn't have so many problems. The police, of course, police and firefighters take up about 50 to 75% of a local city's budget. You can easily see a scenario where, with the right amount of surveillance, robots, and so on, you probably wouldn't be able to get rid of police entirely, but you probably would be able to remove the firefighters fairly simply, and replace them with people that are going to maintain those systems, whether in the office or the residence. So suddenly about 20% of your budget will probably open up, maybe even more. You can go back to having volunteer stations. That, of course, threatens local politicians, because anybody that takes up about 25 to 50% of a local city's budget is going to be allies with at least one of the two or all the major players within that city, who, of course, have friends and businesses that they prefer. You can also see, based on what I've just said, why China has been so successful in renewable energy and building smart cities ahead of almost everyone else. Because if China is the one that has state-sponsored private entities, if it has a one-party state, if it can wave a magic wand and require, without much opposition, if it can require everyone in every new building to have solar panels and renewable energy, it can figure out how to do it properly. It can gain the incremental knowledge that gets you to the next level, and then eventually begin exporting its expertise. And we know that China has done a good job, because the United States is so concerned about China's expertise that it's putting tariffs on China's industries, semiconductors, you name it, whatever it needs in order to move ahead in the global industry, and which means, of course, global stature. And semiconductors are interesting because they're tied into satellites on some level, and almost everything we do, including phones. And you notice that China does not have its own, as far as I know. It probably has a space station, but it doesn't have its own global GPS, or there's different standards, right, depending on Galileo and so on. It doesn't have a globally recognized satellite standard in the same way that the Americans do. And why? Part of that is, again, you are still constrained by finite amounts of money and tax revenue. And so China has, just looking at the data from a high level, has invested in infrastructure and its own people for at least the last 20 years. And as a result, is gaining a middle class. It's probably had the most numbers of people that moved from poverty into the middle class over the last 45 years. And I don't think anybody else even comes close. Look back on those infrastructure investments, and you can see why. So, a lot of people would say that if you want to move ahead and export something like social media, oh, by the way, the debt, right, is eventually designed to create a market-leading position based on expertise that is difficult to mimic, and then you use international tribunals to prevent copycats, and then you are able to export your standard all over the world, which means that at some point you're going to start making loans in your currency. It's the same thing that corporations do or used to do. They got in trouble for doing that. If you were, say, GE and General Electric, you wanted to convince a city to take over build a wind turbine, in many cases you would have GE Financial that loaned them the money. That's not a problem, well, at a lower interest rate. And, you eventually make that money back. You can see how that would be a problem if you have rising interest rates. Once again, you see why we have low interest rates today and for quite some time. So you're trying to export it to develop a standard that can then lower costs even more. Once you develop the standard, if you have a single standard, it's also easier to protect. So you have to, everything over time, not only in terms of numbers, over time gets cheaper as long as the cash flow is there to pay off the debt. And you can see that in SimCity, where, at some point you start off manufacturing steel, and eventually you move up to plastics. You use steel, wood. Those are the first two. You need those to build houses. And cement eventually gets there. I think cement comes too late in the game because I'm not sure how they're building the roads. But in any case, cement also gets there eventually. But once you get to the point where you're able to move into things like plastics and minerals, you start not to manufacture, the smaller things like steel, or the cheaper things like steel and wood, because you just buy them from other places. And you focus, again, factories have a finite capacity. You focus your factories and your manufacturing on more expensive items. That also gets you in trouble if you're only creating or setting your factory line to create high value items, because at some point you're gonna need wood. If no one else is selling that wood, you've got a problem. Or if nobody else is selling steel, you can't grow. You've got a problem. You can see again what's happening now. The global supply chain is being disrupted in order for countries to figure out what they need so they can become more independent. And that's what countries are doing now. And it remains to be seen whether any country can extricate itself from this sort of advanced system of trade that values work so differently based on geographic location, as well as currency. So, based on who's more developed and who's not as developed, and who has a standard that allows them to get the cash flow back into their country, that then allows them to maintain their currency as the most reliable one worldwide, which then encourages more people to use it, which then allows the issuing country to have more debt than most other countries, which then of course allows those countries to grow faster and again gain that incremental knowledge that would allow them to establish a market-leading position. Now, we're trying to sort of put all this in context, and if you look at all of this, obviously, software is involved. Software has always been involved. But you're also looking at this idea that we're going to lose whatever privacy we have left in exchange for a more self-dependent system, in exchange for more sovereign autonomy. And you also see why, as a libertarian, this is concerning, because you can take the example of social media. And social media is chaos. And there's an estimate that 30% of Twitter's accounts are bots or trolls. We don't know even if they're in the country or not, and so on and so forth. That's a huge number, by the way, 30%. So you really can't really export it, although you don't have a choice, because if you're exporting phones, the host country is going to have a problem blocking software simply because there are always ways around firewalls, VPNs and so on and so forth. It's also true that a lot of the security software in place is ineffective because it doesn't really account for things like spoofing. It's not a good idea to block people based on content, because even though you're able to track digital IP addresses that go back to computers, there's no way to know whether or not someone is being spoofed. In other words, there's no way to know if someone is pretending to be somebody else's computer or pretending to be in another country. So you see that social media made a lot of promises and created a lot of jobs, primarily, especially in security. And a lot of the digital infrastructure is now moving into finance, because it's always been about transferring money back and forth in a secure way. The social media, all these other things have been a bit of a show in order to strengthen America's number one industry at this point, which is finance, which goes back to debt, which was all the things we just talked about, single standard, and so on and so forth. With social media, that became a problem. They're now moving into finance in order to piggyback off of established strengths. Now, with social media and the surveillance and digital surveillance, you've got some issues politically. In other words, there are some differences in governance. And the Chinese model, of course, says that, we have a single standard. We've been colonized before. We're now in a position where, we may have occupied Tibet in order to secure water resources. That was back in 1952. And we're investing in that region in order to make sure that everyone prospers. But we're not willing to give up our right to self-autonomy, not only because we've gotten Hong Kong back, but again, we have an established record of building a middle class. And so there's no reason for us to have competition, and there's also no reason why you shouldn't trust us to gather as much data as possible and then use that data to protect you, the Chinese citizen. Singapore does the same thing, but Singapore is small, and Singapore also has a record of almost total success. So Singapore, because it's small, has succeeded on this middle way. It has strong defamation laws that essentially curtail political speech. It's got a history of shutting down threats to its executive branch, which again worked out because its executive branch was probably the best and the most competent political branch in the entire world in probably the last 400 years. Sorry, Singapore hasn't been around that long, right? But if you judge it, from 1963 or whatnot, depending on when you decide Merdeka or Independence Day happened, there was a referendum and so on and so forth. But if you take what Singapore has done since the 1960s, very few countries, I don't think any other country can compare to what it's built today, which includes a country with where 10% of its population are millionaires. The highest standard of living worldwide. No such thing as a homeless Singaporean. Small country. You can do that if you're a small country that has a valuable port. Now, if you're looking at all of these developments from a libertarian perspective, you're concerned because you're sympathetic to the Chinese model because it's got a different history than the United States, even though the United States was also colonized by the French and the Spanish. But it's got a different history of, Hong Kong and Macau were taken forcibly by Europeans to increase their influence in globalization and, of course, shipping routes. In the United States, this idea that we're going to allow the chaos of social media to alter our structure, which is distrustful of government, this idea doesn't bode well with a lot of people. And it also doesn't bode well because it probably won't work, even if you're able to have total surveillance, because there's always a way around not only a law, but digital infrastructure. Because at some point a human being still has to be involved, who can be bribed or convinced or whatnot. If you look at it that way, what people are really saying is we don't want total surveillance because it's not going to work. It's not actually going to give us total security. And the reason for that, again, is because there's always a human being somewhere along that supply chain that is corruptible. Even if you switch it to machines, you might be able to have a security software that tells somebody that something is amiss based on the data. It could even be like, hey, this house on this block is taking up too much, 10 times more electricity than everyone else. Go check it out. Even if you have the police check it out, let's say the police are corrupt, that's fine. Let's say you have private security, check it out. Also, at some point, it's pretty easy to see that if you have enough money or enough influence politically, you're still going to be able to do whatever you want. So you look around and you look at the American model, which is completely fragmented. Local, state, federal, it's completely fragmented, and it looks to be in decline, especially when compared to China's advances over the last 40 years. And again, the question is, where do we go from here? the opposition to the philosophically to the Chinese model is that, number one, it lacks diversity. And even if it gets a small amount of diversity, it's not likely to have widespread immigration. In fact, if anything, it's likely to drive out a lot of the intellectuals and a lot of the creative types to other countries. And that's true today. It has been in the past. There are, of course, ample numbers of creative Chinese people born in China. But if you look at something like movie making, this tiny country of Taiwanese, of Taiwan, that include the people that lost the Chinese Revolution and had to flee, that one country, which is tiny, you could probably say that they've done a better job overall in terms of being creative than China, which of course is vastly larger and with a much larger resource base. So in some cases, being small is better, especially if your system is opposed to somebody else's system that then gives you some sort of principles that you can sort of hang your hat on when the country becomes more and more divided politically. I always say choose your enemies wisely because a lot of the principles within human nature and human history are oftentimes not independently made, but they're just in opposition to somebody else, to what came before them. And you can see how hatred continues to multiply within that kind of a system of opposition to what's come before. So if you're looking at this from a diversity standpoint, from a pro-immigration standpoint, you can easily see how a total surveillance state, despite being more efficient, will probably drive away a lot of people that would otherwise stay and contribute to the country's artistic and intangible growth. Within the United States, it's hard to see how our system is going to be successful, simply because it's taken up so much debt just to survive. And what I didn't mention before was with the housing, not only do you gain efficiencies when more people are buying your product, which then leads to, an easier time making your product, which then allows you to upgrade because you've got that cash flow coming in. It also means that insurance costs go down. So you build a house that is self-cleaning, that has solar panels, that has robots, that's robot security guards. You would reasonably expect your insurance, your homeowner's insurance, to go down. So again, within this financial system, there's this idea that the costs eventually go down as the superior product or service is elevated within the system. But all of that needs a boost to dislodge existing vested interests. So as we move forward, the question becomes, number one, can China be a model for the whole world without accepting immigrants and refugees? And I don't mean to say the United States has accepted voluntarily a lot of refugees, or should be lauded for doing that more so than other countries. In fact, Turkey, Jordan especially relative to its size, Iran, they've taken in, you could be argued that per capita they've taken in far more refugees than the United States. And so when you look at China and when you look at its place in the world, there's no question that economically it's going to be able to set a standard. But the other question becomes, how does it move up the value chain in terms of culture, in terms of setting the story, so that its content providers and content creators are able to tell their side of the story without relying on, Taiwanese, you could argue, interference or Taiwanese competition, which obviously has its own agenda, given that they were driven out of China during the Chinese Revolution. That's something China has to wrestle with. That's why I keep trying to explain to people the economics are easy. It's the culture that's difficult, because you can't really manufacture it. There's no sort of definitive path. There's no reason why England has a Zadie Smith, and America has a Junot Diaz, and we don't have anyone similar in China. There probably is somebody there, I'm hoping. It's just that we don't know that person because there's been insufficient resources allocated to translation and distribution, as well as a global content licensing scheme that makes sense so that I can read people, Chinese authors, in a way that makes sense rather than rely on what is oftentimes, simply what I call Google Translate translations, which make any book too dry to read. I'm thinking specifically of the book about JD.com. It was a book about Alibaba. It was written by a British author, not an American author. It was quite good. But the one that was translated from Chinese into English by a human translator was terrible. It was just too dry. And I know that the original book was probably much better. It's just that we haven't quite gotten China's future culturally is unknown because we haven't figured out a blueprint for taking a book in Chinese by a Chinese author and then translating it in a way that makes sense. In order to do it properly, you have to have people that are, I guess we call them third culture kids. We just don't have enough of those kids yet. They're all probably going into banking, not translation. So there are limits to technological progress. Within the United States, we are beginning to understand those limits. And if you're a libertarian, you're also beginning to understand that government is outgunned by the private sector. Not only because so many religious institutions have taken over healthcare and welfare and received tax breaks as a result, as well as government funding, but also because if you outsource or if you delegate contracts to the private sector in order to make yourself more lean and more efficient, you, number one, lose the knowledge that's necessary to regulate outside actors, and in doing so, cede your country to private industry. China is, of course, not doing that. It's been successful because it has not done that. It does not have a fragmented corporate structure. If anything, it's got the opposite. The United States, on the other hand, can argue that we've made government leaner. Our private sector is the one that leads the way. We don't see a problem with this. And, it's not just healthcare, right? It's so many other things. And overall, number one, you can see why this might be a problem, right? Number one, it's a problem because if money is too cheap, somebody somewhere can fund a nonprofit that develops a product that may be inimical to not just your culture, but societal progress. You can think about just what's happened. We mentioned healthcare. You can think about what's happened in psychology, in the psychological profession for quite some time. Right? You've got electric shocks. You've got lobotomies. If there's enough money involved, then you're in a position where somebody or anybody somewhere with enough money and with low enough interest rates can create a nonprofit, and in creating that nonprofit, export and import any cockamamie idea he or she has, whether or not it works, because it's a private nonprofit. It could be a private industry, private or a nonprofit, and at that point, the only check and balance is an audit by the government. But the government has to have expertise in order to do that audit, so that you don't end up with all these nonprofits going out there doing things that might, number one, cause inflation in ways that are unpredictable. Number two, just again, get involved in things that don't necessarily make a lot of sense for the populations or the culture. And what you see in the United States is this idea where libertarians have argued for smaller government. They haven't really gotten it, especially not at the federal level. And you can say that the libertarian movement has been quite a failure. All that happened in response to this idea of smaller government, of more efficient government, was more debt. In other words, the smaller government became, what really happened wasn't necessarily efficiency gains, it's just that debt became cheaper, and as a result, the government never really had to adjust itself in a way to become efficient. It could simply go to the bank and get a loan. And remember, the SimCity game that I'm playing, it's not possible realistically, if a bank was involved, you would just borrow money. And the whole game would be negotiating with your banker and the insurance companies, trying to get lower premiums. So in the US, the new libertarian movement probably needs to focus not only on leanness, but on efficient regulation, on the idea that government exists to regulate in a way that makes sense, especially what we call externalities, like pollution, climate change, and so on and so forth. And the real problem with legislation and lawyers is that even if something doesn't get passed on the national or state level, because the private actors and private companies are so strong and have such easy access to money, if something is denied by the government, there's nothing stopping it from being released into the wild by private money. In some cases, that's a good thing. In some other cases, like social media, it doesn't quite turn out as planned. And then you've got to deal eventually with the externalities, in some cases, which are unpredictable. So, if you're moving forward as an American, you want to focus on regulation that is smart. Smart, not just smart homes, but smart regulation that allows at some point not the extinguishing of vested interests, like the local fire department, but it allows you to incorporate some sort of mechanism that uses the expertise that was built up by the fire department and melds it with the with technological advances. No one, remember I talked about why China isn't able to export its culture? Nobody knows the blueprint. Well, guess what? Nobody knows the blueprint on how to ease in the transition from all these trillion-dollar vested interests in America into essentially a more efficient world. I guess my argument is that libertarians will be the only ones, or some third party, maybe even a combination of the Libertarian Party and the Green Party. You can imagine a vice president and a president from those two parties on the same ticket. You can make the argument that kind of a movement going forward can get 5% of the vote. That's what's happened in Europe. Vastly different political movements have set aside their differences to take on the status quo. So for an American, what you want moving forward is not only efficient government, but government that cares about regulation and protection of the individual. An example of that is just the fact that we have all these different agencies, right? Federal, state, local. None of them really protect you from small ticket items. Like, let's say a company scams somebody by creating a legal contract that is too difficult to understand and misleading in a way that violates the spirit of a state law. Well, state agencies are not going to bring lawsuits or litigation on your behalf, and it's not worth it for a private lawyer to take on that case. So within the United States, you have this idea that a lot of the corporations and a lot of the marketing teams are out of control. And that's being fueled in part by social media. And the marketing that's generated from social media as we moved into a more picture-based world, as opposed to a world that would probably be more likely to produce a Zadie Smith. And remember, everything is incremental. So if you're in a world or a nation that is neglecting the written word or neglecting intellectual and political thought, your political structures are within one generation are going to have a really hard time building on that incremental knowledge that no longer exists because it's been wiped out or replaced with something that's inferior. And that's where we started off by saying that it's all about the money. The problem with money is it doesn't really have any culture. It doesn't care about culture. And that's one of the reasons why regulation exists, is to protect your culture. If you have too much foreign investment, your culture goes away. That's also one of the reasons why militaries get so much power or get so much money when they travel overseas and essentially replace the local capital, and then the language, and then the media, and then the culture. So as an American, if you're able to have a party that combines the best elements of the Libertarian Party and the Green Party, you could see a way forward. You could see the idea of the government stepping in to balance the private sector, which is absolutely necessary at this point. You can see how that wouldn't be inimical to the idea of efficient government, or libertarianism, simply because it's the only way to prevent a surveillance state, is to have the government also act in a way that keeps the private sector honest. And if that means more lawyers, the idea behind that would be, or more litigation, the idea behind that would be that litigation on behalf of the individual in areas where, an attorney's fees provision is not viable, or does not provide enough incentive for someone to take the case, you can see how that would work. I just read about this worker that had to wait 6 years to get paid, whether it was a commission case or whatnot. The opposing, the employer had enough, money to hire the best lawyers, and basically appealed all the way to either, I think, the state Supreme Court. And that took 6 years. So it took 6 years to get paid. If you're a small-time lawyer in a small office, you're not going to take a case. It's going to take 6 years to get resolved. And as a result, morality and justice, again, lose out to this idea of efficiency or corporate efficiency and a structure that values money above culture. There's nothing wrong with money. I want to point that out. It's just that the libertarian ideal moving forward would be to recognize that you have to have some government in order to protect the culture and the individual. If you're going to have a structure that essentially outsources a lot of the work of just running a society to the private sector.